Beyond the ethics and values of war, what's going to be really interesting these next 2-3 weeks, particularly for those of you who have never studied Talmud or rarely studied Talmud, we're going to be going into Talmud, and we're going to see how the Talmud works, how the Gemara works, how the Mishnah works, and we're going to see what we see Tuesday nights. A lot of people who have never really gone to classes like mine have studied the Bible, have gone to Bible study, or have gone to a basic shiur, a basic class. And you'll basically learn the surface text and maybe an occasional insight. And what we've been learning with the Tuesday night Navi class is how many deeper layers there are to the text, where you look at the text and you come away from that one verse and the sense is, okay, let's go to the next one. I got it. And then you start looking at Radak and Malbim and Rashbam and Rashi, of course. And before you know it, there's like a whole chapter in that one verse that no one even contemplated. And it's really going to be the same for the next few classes. On that chapter 20, we've been learning Thursday nights the singular chapter in the Torah that is the foundation for the laws and ethics of values of war. And it's Deuteronomy, Devarim, Paragraph, chapter 20. And we're now going to look at it much deeper. We've already sort of, we've drawn everything we can out of the text. Now let's see what the Gemara says. So thank you for being here. And as the new ritual goes, we welcome everyone on YouTube to this class. This is Rabbi Dov Fisher of Young Israel of Orange County. If you like what you see, please give us a like. If you don't like it, give us a like anyway. And if you really don't like it, so give us a dislike, because we don't care. But it's good. It's good. YouTube likes to know that they give you greater distribution if they see more likes. So think like a Valley girl and give us a like. Okay, here we go. Like. The 2 or 3 verses we're going to be basing our intense study today start like this. And we've learned this 100 times, but not like today. So you're going to war and you see horse and chariot, which we learned last week, has all kinds of different implications about how many nations are attacking us, and that God will protect us, whether it's one nation or many nations. Don't be afraid. God will divide them, as in our own lifetimes. He divides Hamas from Hezbollah, from the Judea-Samaria Arabs. They're all marching to different beats. This one went on October 7th. In Lebanon, they waited a year to get started, and they weren't coordinated, and they still can't coordinate, and they can't work together. They kill each other every so often that's the reason there are no elections ever in the so-called Palestine Authority. There's no such thing as Palestine. It's the Arab entity in Judea, Samaria. And whenever 19 years ago, like they had an election and Hamas people ran against Fatah people that kill each other. That's how they have their elections. If you think Trump-Harris is tough, you see Arabs when they go and have a free election, like Fatah against Hamas. And they were, as I said, they were killing each other. And Mahmoud Abbas was like the last man standing. So he's also called Abu Mazen, whole nother story. He was elected to a 4-year term in 2005, and he's now he's the 19th year of his 4-year term, because he doesn't dare have another election. And so God does that. That's a miracle. We don't take enough time to contemplate it. Okay, we learned about that in greater detail last week, and just refreshing your memory, here's for today. And we have learned this more than once in the text, but this is the starting point for what we're going to look at closer. Before you join a battle, the Kohen shall come forward and address the troops. Now, today's focus, first of all, the Kohen will address the troops. Okay. And he says to them, "Hear, O Israel, you're about to join battle with your enemy. Don't let your courage fail. Don't be in fear or panic or dread." because God is with you. He marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory. Okay, so that's the Kohen. The Kohen, the priest, Nigash Kohen, he says that the whole assembly, the entire army is assembled. The entire nation, it's like 603,550 men between the ages of 20 and 60. It could be. And they're all hearing that speech. You Shema Yisrael, atem krevim hayom lemilchama al oyevechem, al yirach levavchem, al teruvi, al tach bezuvi, al tartzu mipneim, ki Hashem Elokechem, ha'olech imachem, lilachem lachem emoivechem, loshia etchem. 2 verses. And then it says, then the officials, the officers, the shotrim, will speak next. V'dibru ha'shotrim ela am lemor. Okay, so the Kohen, it says, speaks 2 verses. Okay. V'dibru ha'shotrim, and then the officers, the generals, el am lemor. Now they speak to the nation. Who is the one? Who is the person who has built a new house in the past year and hasn't dedicated it, hasn't moved in? He should go back to his house. You're exempt from the war. That shouldn't be that, God forbid, he'll die at battle and someone else will end up moving into the house he went through all that trouble building. And who is there who has planted a vineyard and hasn't had the opportunity to harvest the grapes? He should go back to his house and he should enjoy it. Lest, God forbid, he should die at battle. And after having gone through all that trouble to grow a vineyard, plant and grow a vineyard, some other guy comes and starts harvesting the grapes. And who's the man who got engaged to a woman but has not yet married her? Who's the man who has gotten engaged but not yet married? Should go back home, lest he, God forbid, die at battle and someone else take the bride that he was supposed to have. Now it says, and the generals furthermore should say. So what's that about? Never really focused on it during the weeks we studied this. We were focusing on the basic substance. Didn't really pick up on all that much that the Kohen speaks 2 verses, then the Shotrim, the generals, speak how many verses? Let's see, 1, 2, 3 verses. Kohen speaks 2 verses, the generals speak 3 verses. And the official shall go on. The Torah does not, this general principle of Torah interpretation and analysis, that the Torah does not use words purposelessly, without some reason. A writer, I publish articles. Sometimes I write words that are not necessary because I'm trying to be entertaining or I'm trying to be descriptive. So I might use a little bit of florid language, flowery language. But the Torah doesn't work there. Torah doesn't throw in jokes and puns. The Torah doesn't throw in all kinds of flowery language just for literary purpose. Maybe David HaMelech in his Psalms, King David's Psalms and the writings of King Solomon, Shlomo, and in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, or Shir HaShirim, certainly Song of Songs, etc., etc. But the Chumash, the Torah, does not waste words. So the question becomes, why does it say, and the Shotrim, the generals, furthermore shall say, V'yosfu, and they additionally will say, L'daber el ha'am, will additionally speak to the nation. It just said, excuse me. I didn't take my cough medicine. V'dibru ha'shotrim. It already said v'dibru ha'shotrim. So why does it say v'yosfu ha'shotrim? It already says the official shall say, address. Why does it say the official shall go on addressing? All right. Anybody smitten with fear and terror should go home. And don't demoralize everyone else. And then when they're all finished, there should be a count of how many soldiers there are and a command and so on and so forth. Okay, Gemara. So we've learned this, and I just want to make an additional point. all these exemptions we've been learning about apply certainly in Milchemet R'shut, an optional war. We, in our lifetimes, Jews don't make optional wars. That's not part of our culture, and certainly not in the modern era. From the day Israel was established in 1948, there has never been a war that Israel got into just in order to grab more land. Because actually, not for propaganda purposes here, but actually Israel's not a colonialist country. America's colonialist, frankly. What are we doing in Guam and Puerto Rico and historically Philippines and Panama? And look at the British, all the ones that lecture Israel, the British, the French. What were they doing in Morocco and half of France, Algeria, till the Algerians threw them out, and Lebanon and Syria, only Russia, now it's Ukraine and Crimea. All along, they all do it. They all seek to be colonialists. They all seek to expand their territory into other people's countries. That's what World War I was. Germany wanted France, or at least Alsace-Lorraine. France, of course, all the Shakespeare, every other Shakespeare play, the dramas, were all France and England going to war. Henry V had that famous soliloquy by King Henry V, St. Albans Day, and all of that soliloquy. They're all the only country that wasn't colonialist is Israel. Just like the only people that don't do genocide. Genocide is when you set about to wipe out a people. So Germany set about to wipe out Jews. In Africa, various countries set about not only to defeat another country, but to wipe them out, like the Houthis and the Tutsis had a big thing in Hotel Rwanda. There's a movie about that. They try to wipe each other out. Frankly, if we want to be like, want to speak a little bit of truth, Andrew Jackson wanted to wipe out certain Indian tribes. He actually did. It wasn't just to protect the United States. He set about to wipe out certain tribes in order to protect the United States. But you could argue it was a genocide. You could say a lot of great. I'm a big Andrew Jackson fan, not because of that, but because of a million other things. But if we want to use the word genocide, Jackson with the Indians, the French, the British with the Irish. What the British did to the Irish in the 1800s, that's why the Irish came to the United States from 1840, because the British were trying to wipe them out as a people. Unbelievable stuff. And who did they go after with genocide? The Jews. We're like the only people in the world that have no history of wanting, certainly the modern state of Israel, no history of trying to wipe out anybody. You have Arabs, and if Israel wanted to wipe out Arabs, after 12 months, 13 months of bombing Gaza, there wouldn't be anything left. They might want to have new weapons, but they have plenty enough left over. They could have wiped out by now. They could have wiped out all of Gaza if they were trying to do that. The problem is to try to kill. You know the deal. You can't get Hamas. You have to stop Hamas. You have 5 wars with Hamas. Every time you have a ceasefire and a peace deal, and then they break the ceasefire, and they start again. And you finally come to the point after October 7 of a year ago that there's no choice but to wipe out Hamas. Hamas aside, that's okay, Hamas aside. And then Hamas, so where do they store their weapons? They hide their weapons in their people, among the population, in mosques, in hospitals, in schools, in apartment buildings. So through the first 5 wars, you don't know what to do, because there's no way to kill them except bombing the apartment building and the mosque and the school and the hospital. So Israel came up with this thing where they have the soft bombs that hit the roof and let people know the big bomb is coming, and they telephone everybody, yada, yada, yada. That's genocide. Genocide is when a people try deliberately to kill a people. Israel, just the opposite. And if you've lived in Israel or been in Israel, see Arabs all over the place. You see them all over the place. There's Arabs in the Supreme Court of Israel, Arab judges, Arab professors, Arab students. In fact, it's a big debate. There are a lot of people that say they should be thrown out. Every time there's another stabbing by an Arab of a Jew, it starts people off. So all this discussion now that we just learned here in Perek Chaf, that we've been talking about, with the exemptions that we're going to focus on today, those exemptions apply in Milchemet R'shut, in an optional war where Israel tries to expand its borders, which again doesn't happen nowadays. It only happened really once in Jewish history, someone named John or Yochanan Hyrcanus, and he's a very complicated figure in Talmudic times. All in all, he's considered a real bad guy. He had some goodness, but he was a bad guy, and he was part of what led up. It was part of a process that ultimately led up to the Romans coming into Israel and the fall of the Beit HaMikdash. He expanded into Edom. You know the map from our classes all the time. To the east of Israel is Aram up north, now Syria, and then there's Ammon and Moab, which is now Jordan, and then there's Edom. And he conquered Edom, and a lot of them, he forcibly converted them to Judaism against their will. It's the only time in Jewish history. And they're known as Idumeans. Edomites, they're known for whatever reason, not as Edomites, but as Idumeans. And they were brought into Israel, and from them came the seeds of destruction of Jews in the land of Israel. Herod, 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 Horus in the Gemara, he was from forcibly converted Idumeans, and he became in charge. The Romans put him in charge, and although he was a great builder, he brought horrible destruction, leading into the ultimate Roman destruction. So we don't forcibly convert people the way that the Crusaders tried to convert us and the Inquisitors tried to convert us. We don't forcibly convert. We don't even go out converting people. We even discourage al pi halacha. Jewish law requires that if someone comes to me to convert, we have to turn them away 3 times. Literally. We have to be nice so that they do have a door open if they want to come a 4th time. We have to discourage them 3 times. And you don't insult them, but like you say, I'm sorry, I really apologize. I'm very busy now. Can you come back in a month? This is just a bad time. The holidays were just over. Then they come back in a month and you say, I'm really, really sorry. I've got to do a wedding this Sunday. I've got to, God forbid this, and I've got a thing with my kids. And can you come back in a month? And then they come back a 3rd time, you do it again. They come back a 4th time, then we put them in a conversion program. So Judaism discourages conversion. Okay. And Judaism actually discourages Milchemet R'shut, going on for voluntary war. If there is a voluntary war, we've just laid out who gets exempt. But if it's a Milchemet Mitzvah, if it's a Torah commanded war, of which there are 2 types, having to destroy the 7 nations, which doesn't apply nowadays, because those 7 nations all have disappeared. But the Canaanite, the Yevusi, the Jebusite, the Perizi, the Perizzite, the Hivi, the Hitti, the Girgashi, those 7 nations that existed in biblical times, it was a Milchemet Mitzvah. You were commanded to come into the land of Israel and wipe them out. And we've talked about that a lot, so we won't go into that again. That's one of the 2 types of commanded wars. So an optional war is a war you don't have to have, but you're going outside to make war against someone, to be an occupier and a colonialist. And a Milchemet Mitzvah commanded war, either what I just described, a war against the 7 nations, and the other kind, which applies even now and is actually what's going on now, is when you're attacked and you're defending the land of Israel. So when they come into the land to attack, it is a Torah commandment to fight back and to fight. And we've been learning so much about that, so I won't repeat a year of what we've learned. And the exemptions we've been learning of the guy that just built a house, and the guy that just got engaged, and the guy that just planted a vineyard, and the guy that's afraid, those exemptions don't apply when they invade Israel, like October 7. So those halachic exemptions don't apply. It's very important to know. So let's say mom literally just built a house, and October 7 happens, and if it were a Torah society built on Torah law, he'd have to go anyway. And he's engaged, he has to go anyway. Now let's learn the Gemara. with that necessary introduction. Here we go. Let's just take this off the screen. Okay. Come on. Okay. It's this 43B. I was preparing, and as I was preparing, I got so into it that I just kept going beyond what I had to prepare. So just give me a second, I'll get it there. I think it's 4-3. Okay. Masechet Sotah, Daf Mem Gimel, Folio 43, Amud Aleph, Side A. Matnisin. This is an abbreviation for Matnitin, which is Aramaic for Mishnah. To refresh your memory very briefly, because we've mentioned it a great number of times, we believe that at Mount Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu received the oral law. There was no Torah as we know it, and for 40 days and 40 nights, God taught him Judaism, orally. Not a word written down, and he had to remember all of it in his head. 40 days, 40 nights, he did not eat, did not sleep. He learned 40 days times 24 hours, 960 hours of Judaism class. And then he came down and he taught Judaism. That's why he's called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our Rav, Harav Shalanu, Moshe Harav Shalanu, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. What did he teach? He taught what he learned for 960 hours up on the mountain. And that's known as the oral law. Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral law. Over the next 40 years in the desert, God, at different occasions, intervals, had Moshe stop, and God would dictate to him word for word, and Moshe took dictation, not his own writing, not his own rephrasing, but literally taking dictation word for word, writing it on parchment, what we now know as the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. The Torah they read in shul. That's known as Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah. There's the oral Torah and the written Torah. There are 2 opinions. One opinion is that at different intervals over the 40 years, Hashem would say to Moshe, now let's do some dictation. And the other opinion is that that's called Torah, Parsha. And then the other opinion is Torah Kulat Netna, that at the very, very end, in the 40th and final year, God dictated all of it before Moshe died. And that's what we have. That's why we say in shul, when they lift up the Torah, Sotah Torah, Asher Sam Moshe, this is the Torah that Moshe placed b'fnei b'nei Yisrael, to the Jewish people, Al pi Hashem b'yad Moshe, by the word of God, by the hand of Moshe. Now, the written Torah we have today, that's what they read in shul. The oral law was transmitted by word of mouth. It was oral, al peh. And for centuries, it was nothing was put in writing. And yes, some of it was forgotten. Rabbi, if there's 960 hours of oral teaching, wouldn't some of it be forgotten? Yeah, it was. A bunch was forgotten. We don't know what was forgotten because it's been forgotten. And then every so often there would be variations of the transmission. You've got 100 people hearing the same oral transmission, and some people think they heard this, and some people think they heard that. So if they could go to Moshe later and say, I was in the class and I heard what you said, did you say this or that? Moshe could clarify. But eventually Moshe was gone. And that's why there arose different schools, academies, who had slightly different transmissions that they passed down from generation to generation. And that's why in the Mishnah basically was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's effort finally to put it all centuries later into writing, because under the pressure of Roman oppression, they were killing out the rabbis who knew the oral transmission, and the fear was the Romans are going to kill out everybody. The Romans are going to kill out all the leading rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, all the leading rabbis, and sure, there will be Jews remaining, but there won't be anybody with the capacity to transmit what's been transmitted. So we're going to have to put it in writing. It's like a reason to have a day of fasting and mourning. That was the Mishnah, bringing the oral tradition into writing. And in doing so, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi included, he left out certain things because there's just too much to put in, and that's called a breita or a brisa. Those are things that had the same kind of authority, but he just had to leave some of it out because there's just too much. It would be like, are you going to have an encyclopedia that runs 23 volumes in the days of encyclopedias, or you can have an encyclopedia run 7,000 volumes? So at some point, the editor has to leave things out that are very valuable. But when you wrote a term paper in school with 15-page page limit, and you had 30 pages of notes, you had to leave some of it out, even though it was good stuff. And so parts of the oral law that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi left out became known as breita. And what he left in, including minority opinions, when there would be like two different traditions and he would make the call, or the rabbis would make the call, which one is the majority opinion we're going to follow. But we also will preserve the minority opinion, because for all we know, the minority opinion is the one that Moshe brought down from Mount Sinai. So based on halacha, we follow the majority opinion. There's a pasuk in Psalms, Tehillim, HaShemayim Shemayim Lashem, v'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. The heavens belong to God, and the earth he gave to people. And the rabbis learn out from that he gave the Torah, but it was given to the rabbis to learn it, transmit it, and understand what the law is. And so if there's confusion, the majority would rule. And it's like in the United States, frankly, or really, I should say the United States is like Judaism, where the Supreme Court sits, and this is very important to understand, especially when we're going to get into a deep Mishnah Gemara thing. In the United States, our Torah is the Constitution. It's 200 plus years old. And so that's the Torah. And then there's reform Americanism. Just like there's Orthodox Americanism, there's Reform Americanism. What did the Reform Jews do? They basically abandoned the Torah. Whatever they like, they keep. Whatever they don't like, they don't keep. They like the social justice. They don't like that you can't eat pork. They like that you should have a day of Rosh Hashanah. They don't like that you're not allowed to do all these things on Shabbat. So they take what they like. They get rid of what they don't like. They interpret it however they like. Well, the reason Torah said you can't have pork is because in those days, people didn't know it was dangerous to eat if it wasn't prepared properly, but now people know how to avoid trichinosis, so God would have allowed it. That's what they say. Okay. So you have Reform Judaism, which actually is not Judaism at all. And you have Orthodox Judaism, which really is not Orthodox Judaism. It's Judaism. You have Reform constitutionalism, and you have Orthodox constitutionalism. You have people who basically say, literally now, major professors at Harvard and Yale Law School, all these are saying we should throw out the Constitution. It's 250 years old. It's no longer relevant to our lives today. We need a brand new Constitution. And of course, it'll be drafted by Harvard and Yale law professors. And that's what we need. Let's throw it all out. And then there's the Orthodox ones that say, this Constitution has gotten us through 250 plus years, or just about 250, give or take, 1789. And this Constitution is a living document that continues to apply. And when new issues come up, we fight it up to the Supreme Court. And just like the rabbis in Judaism, if there's a new thing, according to Jewish law, they rule, what does the Torah principles, what do those principles mean nowadays with this new issue? So the Supreme Court rules, what did the founding fathers, what they handed us, how apply it today? And then within that framework, the ones that keep the Constitution, there are the strict constructionists who are like the Orthodox, where their basic principle is, what does the Constitution say? And we have to fit our personal opinions, we have to put it aside, and we have to fit into the Constitution. And on the other hand, you have the Sotah mayors And the other one that recently got named, and their attitude is, we don't need the Constitution. We know what the founding fathers did, and we're capable now of applying our own opinions. And that's the great debate. That's the great philosophical debate. So it is in Judaism. Or actually, the other way, so it is in Americanism. So in Judaism, Orthodox, the Reforms say the problem with Orthodox is you haven't bent anything for 3,000 years. But that's because they don't know what's going on with us. With us, for example, electricity came to be a regular thing in houses. And the question became, is electricity fire? And, well, there are reasons to call it fire. It starts, you can have an electric fire, and it creates heat, and it creates light, and there are reasons to say, well, it's not exactly the same as fire. And you could say that when you switch something on, there is a spark, and it's an interesting question. And so it went to rabbis. Rabbi, what do we do with the question of fire? And what do we do with the question of electricity on Shabbos? And the majority ruling is, we're not allowed to turn electric on and off on Shabbos. Okay. And then in the 1950s, they came up with a new gizmo called a timer. And the question is, could you put a lamp on a timer and set it before Shabbat so that you're not touching anything on Shabbat, and it's just going on its own in Shabbat? And then, can you do that? And then the rabbis had to deal with that. And the general majority opinion was, yes, that's okay. You can set timers before Shabbat because you're not influencing or operating electricity throughout Shabbat. So that's okay. So then a new question came up. There's a new thing called television. Are we allowed, now that you ruled that we can use a Shabbos clock, namely a wall timer or a lamp timer, now that you ruled you could use a timer before Shabbat, for Shabbat, can you put a TV on a timer to automatically go on Friday night so we can cut Friday night Shabbos dinner short to find out who killed JR or who shot JR? And the rabbis analyzed it and ruled, no, you may not use a timer for television on Shabbat. Well, why not? That's still not using electricity. Yeah, but you shouldn't have a TV on Shabbat because of different aspects of Shabbat law. So in the same way, that's how the Mishnah is going to work. And the Talmud is going to work. We get a little flavor of it now. These are important principles. So Judaism works off the interplay of the written law, which we've been learning in chapter 20 of Devarim, book of Deuteronomy, with the oral law that was brought down in the Mishnah, we're going to learn. And then the Gemara comes 300 years later as the Mishnah, or 200 years later, as the Mishnah becomes 200 years old and does not focus so much on bringing from Mount Sinai. 200 years later, there was much in the Mishnah that the rabbis found needed clarification. So they discuss and debate, what does the Mishnah mean? And that's the Gemara, discussing, showing you the rabbis' discussions. Let's get started, and enough introduction, which was very important, but now let's get to business. No, take this off the screen and take that on the screen. Okay, here we go. So the Mishnah says, "V'dibru hashotrim l'am lemor," and the officer shall speak to the nation and say what we just read. Who's the one who built the house? Go with the house. The Mishnah says, and we didn't actually go this deep, so now we will. He is sent home if he even built a storehouse for straw. So you thought, I thought, we thought that they sent home a guy that really went to the trouble of building a house to live in. Chaval, what a shame that he's, God forbid, not going to make it through the war and never be able to go into his house. It applies even if he simply had just built a house for straw, a storage unit for straw, base habakar, or if he had just built a barn for cattle. In other words, he has a house already, but he just spent time building a barn. He goes back home and does not fight. Beit ha'etzim, or he just built a woodshed. Beit ha'otzarot, or he just built a warehouse. In other words, an auxiliary building, not just a patio on his backyard patio, not just that he changed the wooding, the floor, or whatever, but if he built a thingy, a permanent structure, so it would not be a sukkah that's not meant to be permanent but only up for a week. But if he built a straw storehouse, or a stable, or a woodshed, or a storehouse, a warehouse for goods, and furthermore, you do not have to be the one who built it. When I moved to Israel, at that time in my life, 35 of us families moved to Israel to create a new community in Samaria, Neve Elisa, a community of Karnei Shomron. And we worked from blueprints. The land was absolutely empty. We got permission from the Israeli government. We named it for the recently deceased wife of Prime Minister Begin, Alitza Begin. So we named it Neve Elisa. And we hired an architect, and he drew up plans for the houses. And we hired a kablan, a builder, whose job it was to build the houses. And I'll stop at that point because the story goes in another direction. And that's Habona. That's you built the house. And it turned into something incredibly aggravating. Again, I'll spare you today. Maybe I've even talked about it in the past. And it took about 2 years to build this house. Long story. For that aggravation, you could really understand why they would say someone who went through 2 years aggravation to build a house, everything I went through, or anybody might go through, and the idea that he'd never get a chance, even one day, to live in that house, sleep in that bedroom, turn on that kitchen oven or stove. So that I understand. But the Mishnah adds, V'echad halokeach, even if you only bought the house, or the barn, or the woodshed, or the treasure, or the warehouse, whether you built it or you bought it, you're exempt for a year. Even if you simply inherited it and didn't spend money at all, and didn't even go through the trouble of looking at houses to decide which one to buy. In fact, even someone who got a house as a gift. So you never could have imagined you were going to get it. Came from nothing, came from nowhere. All those people are exempt. So we're learning there's a lot more people involved here. Umi ha'ish asher nata kerem v'lo chilo. And then they say whoever planted a vineyard and didn't have the chance to harvest the grapes. The Mishnah says the exemption applies to one who planted the vineyard. It doesn't even limit itself. The exemption is not limited only to people who planted a vineyard, but even if you planted 5 fruit trees. Ilan, we learned last week, is a tree. Ma'achal, from the word ochel, a tree from which you could eat, a fruit tree. Some chamisha, 5, echad, 1. One who plants 5 trees of food, fruit trees, also is exempt. But afilu mechameshet haminin, and they don't even have to be 5 trees of the same sort, like 5 orange trees or 5 apple trees, but even 5 trees, one of each of the 5 species. What species? What's that all about? The Torah tells us in Deuteronomy 8, Devarim Perek, chapter 8, God tells the Jews through Moshe, you're coming to a wonderful land. You're almost done with your 40-year journey, and you're going to be going to a wonderful land. Because the Lord your God is bringing you to Eretz, land, Tova, good. He's bringing you to a good land, Eretz Nachale Mayim, a land that has streams of water. Ayanot utahomot. Here you are in desert, 40 years of desert, You'll be coming to a land where there's streams of water and springs and fountains. Yotziim babik'ah uvahar. And whether you're on the plain, like what we now know of as Ra'anana and Kfar Saba, in the coastal plain, or in the hilly places like Yerushalayim, wherever you go, there'll be water. Your dry desert days will be over. And not only that, where you've been in the desert, you get your food from the sky, manna, from heaven, because there's no food growing out of sand. You're going to go into a magical land. Eretz chita u'sa'ora, v'gefen u'te'ena v'rimon eretzeit shem udvash. You're going to see growing from the ground a land of wheat and barley. That's the two main holy grains, taking nothing away from rice. But that's why rice is actually treated as different from wheat and barley. Like if you eat a meal and you have something made of grain, of wheat and barley, there's an after bracha that's recited. Al hamichya v'al kalkala v'al tenuva sadeh. It's known as the Me'ein Sheva, the bracha based on eating any of the seven. What seven? Wheat, barley, grapes, that's 3, figs, pomegranates, that's 5, olives, that's 6. Honey is actually a reference to dates, So that's 7. If you have any of those 7 in a meal, the after bracha, if you eat bread as part of the meal, the after bracha is the full berchat hamazon, the benching. If you eat a meal without bread, but you do have something like that, let's say a cake, cookies, you had stuff with grapes, figs, etc., you would recite the Me'ein Sheva, the after bracha of the 7. If you eat something that had anything else, drink a glass of water, orange juice, you had something with rice, even though rice is a grain, you do not recite the Me'ein Sheva. You simply recite Borei Nefashot Rabot V'Chesronan. Okay, so what are the 5 fruit? When he says the 5 species of fruit, it just says in the Mishnah, the 5 species. So what are the 5 species? Oranges, apples, grapefruit, pineapples? No. Wheat and barley are grain. So it's geffen, borei pri geffen, grapes, te'ena, figs, rimon, pomegranates, eretz zait shemen, zayat is olives, davash, honey. The rabbis understand it refers to dates, because dates are incredibly sweet, particularly the ones that grow in Israel that are known as medjool dates. If you've never tried them, if you go and you buy dates at the supermarket, you should look to see what dates you're getting. I never paid attention till a few years ago. Medjool, Medjool, Medjool. They're side by side with the regular dates. Medjool dates are very, very different from regular dates. Israel, fascinating as it says, Israel is the world's leading exporter of medjool dates. I don't know if it's medjool or medjool. World leading exporter. The Torah says you're coming to a land, Davash, that will be famous for its dates, and wouldn't you know, it's the world's leading exporter of dates, medjool dates. And they're completely different from the regular dates. They're like so sweet, they're sweet like honey. Anyway, the Mishnah is saying that if you plant 5 trees, that the military exemption for someone who has planted a vineyard, hasn't yet harvested the grapes, applies even for someone who has planted 5 trees, fruit trees, whether they're 5 of the same, 5 date trees, 5 olive trees, whether they're 5 of one of each of 5 different kinds. Okay, so we continue. But it's got to be of those. It's got to be of those. It can't, so orange trees don't count. Apple trees don't count. Okay. So, yes, be echad anotea, the echad amavrich, the echad amarkiv, And it's the same whether we're talking about someone who literally planted it or someone who did something to help it grow, and even someone who grafts, which is going to bring us to more learning later, because on the surface, you're not allowed to graft. The Torah elsewhere commands we're not allowed to graft different species. Interesting halacha that, look, I mean, a lot of us live in urban life. We don't plant trees. If we plant trees at all, we're having a gardener bring a tree and put it in, or if we're really ambitious, we get the tree, but to start grafting trees, we don't do that. Just even if you were allowed to, we're an urban society now. But in an agricultural society, people do that for all kinds of reasons. The halacha is you are not allowed to graft trees. So the rabbi, don't we eat like nectarines? I've seen rabbis eat nectarines, and we're allowed to eat from grafted trees. It's very unusual. Most things, if you're not allowed to benefit from someone else doing it. You can't, if a guy holds up a bank, you're not allowed to, the guy owes you $100. So he holds up a bank, or for that, probably $10,000 or $100,000. So he holds up a bank to repay the loan. You're not allowed to take the money that way. Actually, a shul is not allowed to take a donation if they know that the money is stolen, or they know the money was generated illegally. It's a big thing. Every so often it becomes a thing where, God forbid, the news breaks that somebody was involved with corruption, and it turns out there's a hallway in the shul or some room that's named for him because he made a big donation, and it becomes a big thing, and the boards of directors deal with it. And here in Beverly Hills, Rabbi Stephen Weil, it was a big thing that there was a guy in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, that was found. The FBI found that the guy was involved in bad stuff, and Rabbi Weil had the name taken off the wall. That was a big thing, big thing. It helped that Rabbi Weil had just received a new job appointment at the Orthodox Union in New York that would be starting in about a month or two. So he wouldn't have to. He was still a wonderful. He is a wonderful guy. But as someone who's practiced rabbi, it's always easier to do the right. Not taking away from what he did. It was heroic for him, but for another, it's always easier if you on the way out anyway. So what we have is a very unusual law that if you graft trees, someone else is allowed by halacha to eat the fruits of those grafted trees. But what we just learned in the Mishnah is that they're giving an exemption to a guy who grafts a tree. Not only a guy who planted a vineyard, but a guy who grew 5 fruit trees, or a guy who grafted a tree, 5 trees, not just grafted one tree, had to do 5. So we're going to learn later, maybe not tonight, next week, but we're going to learn, the Gemara is going to go into greater detail. How can it be that a Jew could graft a tree and that be permitted if it's forbidden? And we'll learn about that. Well, I'll give you a hint. The Gemara is going to tell us if he was grafting the tree, not for food, but to create a stronger wood, to build a fence or something for which you needed construction wood, the Torah permits grafting for the purpose of having a stronger wood or a more pliable wood for construction. It's simply that you're not allowed to graft trees to create a different kind of fruit, even if it's going to be a better fruit. Okay, we continue. So the Mishnah is making clear to us that the exemptions are broader than we realized. Even if the guy plants a fruit tree and 5 fruit trees, and also someone who buys the tree, buys a vineyard, or buys 5 trees, fruit trees, be'echad yaresh, or inherits them, be'echad shenitan lo matana, or got them as a gift, same as above with the one who had a house, whether he built it or bought it or inherited it or got it as a gift. Same with the trees. And the third one, the woman, you're engaged to a woman. Umi ha'ish, and of course, this is not talking gender neutral. It's not saying a man or a woman who gets engaged to a spouse And it's understood in the army, only men serve in the army. Women do not serve in the army. In the Torah army, men serve. And they did a count. There's a whole thing in a census of how many men of army age, military age from age 20 to 60. And they found it was 603,550. And that's who served. Women don't serve in the army. Okay. Umi ha'ish asher era sisha. Echad ha'me'ares raptula. This applies equally. The exemption applies equally whether the man has become engaged to a lady who's never before married, a virgin. Ve'echad ha'me'ares et ha'almana. And it also applies to someone who has become engaged to a widow. Afilu shomeret yavam. Let's talk about yavama. Many of you know what a yavama is. Let's take out a word about a yavama. I'm saying yavama, not Obama. Here's the word yavama. According to the Torah, if God forbid a man's brother dies, and the brother is married and has no children. So if he dies, the living brother is supposed to marry the brother's widow. She is called a yavama, and he's a meyabem. The key word is yavama. So he's supposed to marry her. But let's say for one reason or another, he doesn't want to marry her or he can't marry her. For example, now remember in Torah times, polygamy was totally okay. You were allowed to have more than one wife. That was only ended for Ashkenazim 1,000 years ago by Rabbeinu Gershom in the Gezerah, in the decree. And in fact, Sephardim continued to have polygamy into the 20th century. And really, it was when they arrived in Israel at the time that there was the mass exodus from Yemen and such countries that started expelling all their Jews. There were people arriving with more than one wife. And Israel, a so-called modern Western country, had to figure out what they're going to do about that. And now that doesn't continue anymore. No one was forced to get divorced, but it was understood that it would not continue beyond those already coming in grandfathered in, as you would say. Okay. So in Torah times, you're allowed to have more than one wife. So if a person was married or single, either way, and his brother died, and his sister-in-law, he had to marry her. So what do I mean could marry her? One possibility, he's already married. And he's got a wife who says, no way, no way. He says, but I'm supposed to. She says, yeah, I'm supposed to kill you. And so if a piece of bayit, a shalom bayit, that would be one reason. Maybe he doesn't find her attractive enough. Maybe he doesn't like her personality. Who knows what it is? He doesn't want to marry her. So the Torah gives him a way out called chalitza. Chalitza, they're supposed to go before a Jewish court of law, a bet din, and there's a certain kind of shoe. He wears a certain kind of, in those days, everybody wore those shoes. Nowadays, nobody has that kind of shoe, but every beit din has one of those shoes. And in the old days, it was the shoe he wore. Nowadays, if they go to beit din, he takes off his regular shoe, puts on that shoe so they could proceed. And the Yavama, whom he is technically supposed to marry, because he won't marry her, the Yavama has to unbuckle his shoe, and then she spits on the floor next to the shoe and recites a biblical text, a sentence that basically says, a curse or shame on the brother who refuses to bring a child into the world in memory of his brother. Because the idea was that the brother, the living brother, will have a child with the Yavama, and that child will be deemed the child of the deceased brother. Obviously, the living brother is going to be responsible for the child support and in every which way, But in Judaic terms, the child of that Yavama will be considered as having been the child of the deceased brother. And if the living brother refuses to marry her, then it's shameful. Probably the most famous example of that, though it's not strictly Yavama, because it wasn't the case of brother. And but the most famous case is the book of Ruth, where eventually by the last chapter, Boaz wants to marry her, but explains that he can't marry her because there's someone else ahead of him in line among the halachic descendants who has first rights, right of first refusal, ROFR, to marry her. And the text refers to him as Ploni Almoni. His name, because he turns it down, he turns down the chance to have married Ruth, who became the progenitor of King David, which is the progenitor of the Messiah. So it's so historically shameful, even though he had a good reason. He said he can't afford it. Okay, no judgment. But people would talk about him forever. Oh, what an umglach, and what a shlemazel that he missed out on the chance to be the progenitor of the Mashiach. So in order to spare him shame, the text calls him Ploni Almoni. It's in the last chapter of the book of Ruth. And it says he had to publicly say in the presence of the men of a minyan at that time, nowadays it's a bastin of 3, but then it was like a minyan at the gates of the city, and spit on the ground, the whole thing. And then that gave Boaz the right to marry Ruth. So a Yavama is a woman who is eligible to marry. So what they're saying is that if a man goes to war, is ready to go to war, and word comes back that his brother just died, just as the man who is engaged to get married but has not yet married is exempt, just as the man who's engaged to marry a widow but hasn't married yet is exempt, a man who is at the battle, ready to go to battle, and word comes that his brother just died, leaving behind a wife, a prospective Yavama marriage, which, by the way, that man may then go back home and decide, I don't want to marry, let's do chalitza with the shoe, and he goes back home. So that's what the Mishnah is saying. It applies even in the case of Yavama. Number 3. So let's continue. We have a few more minutes, like 4 minutes or so. Let's finish. But the afilu shama shemet achiv b'milchama, even if he's at battle, ready to go to battle, and he hears that his brother died in battle, choser ubalo, he goes back. Kol elu ve'elu shomein devrei kohen ma'archei milchama b'chosrin. All of these people who are exempt hear the word of the Kohen, the Kohen HaMashuach, the Kohen designated to lead the people at battle. We've talked about that concept, and they go back. But even though they go back, they're not allowed to just have nothing whatsoever to do with the war effort. Umisapkin mayim umazon umendaknin et hadarachim. Having been exempted from going into the fight so that they could go back and harvest their vineyard and go into their house and marry their wife, they remain on duty from their base at home and the vineyard and everything. They need to actively provide water and food, supplies to the soldiers. So when people go to war, there's a supply line. I mean, people are going forward, march forward. What about food? What about water? What about all their needs? Part of a war effort is to maintain a supply line. Many times you may even read about wars or if you read history books or movies, or you may even read in the local papers, that one of the strategies at war is sometimes one side tries to disrupt the other side's supply lines. So if they can't get food and water to the soldiers, it leaves their soldiers in a real pickle. And sometimes they have to stop advancing and go back, or they have to figure out a way to restore their supply lines. So, umisapkin mayim umazon, those who are exempt must continue playing an active role, providing water and food, umitakninin hadrachim, and they have to pave the roads. Now, in the modern time, you have tanks, and you have other kinds of vehicles. And in those days, I don't know, you had wagons and horses and chariots. The chariot, chariot on a really bumpy, hilly road, that's not so great when you're going to war. And part of the war effort was you had to pave the roads with whatever tools they had in the old days for the purpose of facilitating the chariots. So a person exempt is not like he just goes home and is a cheerleader. He's got a schwitz. He's got to go to work. And we'll continue next week with people who do not get the exemption. Just give you a flavor, real quick flavor. These are men who do not get the exemption. If you built a gateway or a veranda or a balcony in your house, no, that's not enough. That's not a house, and that's not a woodshed, and that's not any of those. It's not any of those other things. A warehouse for merchandise. No, that's not enough. Or someone who plants only 4 trees, only 4 fruit trees, or even 5 or more trees, but they don't bear fruit. Or one who remarries his divorced wife. Those don't go back. They don't get an exemption. And we'll continue with that next week. And we're going to talk also about the concept that the Kohen HaMashuach, the Kohen makes the speech and the announcement, and then the officers, the generals make the announcement, v'yasfu hashokrim, and then the generals further announce, and why does it say it twice redundantly, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot more. We're going to learn it through the Mishnah and the Gemara. Thank you so much for being here. And you know how it goes. Sunday, Emir Hashem, we'll have a weekly class on the last week in Jewish life, and Tuesday, Navi class, and Thursday we'll continue, God willing. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.